Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever woken up at 4:30 in the morning, wide awake for absolutely no reason, and just laid there? Maybe you stared at the ceiling wondering, is this just what getting old feels like? Or have you walked into the kitchen, stood right there in the middle of the room, and completely forgotten why you came in, and then felt a little flicker of panic in your chest? Or maybe you've noticed that the big family gatherings you used to look forward to now leave you exhausted, while a quiet afternoon with one good friend feels like the most perfect thing in the world. If any of that sounds familiar, here's what I need you to hear right now. You are not broken. You are not losing it. You are not declining in some sad, unstoppable way. What is happening to you has happened and is happening to every single woman who reaches her 80s. Every single one. Whether she's a former CEO or a lifelong homemaker, whether she exercises every day or has never set foot in a gym, whether she's sharp as a tack or a little forgetful. These changes come for everyone. The difference between the women who struggle through their 80s and the women who genuinely thrive in them, the ones who thrive know what's coming. They understand these shifts. They stop fighting against them and start working with them. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. I'm going to walk you through the 5 changes that happen to almost every woman after 80, and more importantly, I'm going to give you real practical tools to not just survive them, but actually use them to create some of the most meaningful years of your life. And I promise you, by the time we get to number 5, you might just see turning 80 in a completely different light. Stay with me. Change number 1. Your energy and sleep patterns completely rewire themselves. The very first thing that shifts after 80, and it usually happens gradually, so you might not notice it right away, is your body's internal clock. Your sleep, your energy, and your daily rhythm start operating on an entirely different schedule than they did even 5 years ago. Here's what's actually going on inside your body. Your circadian rhythm, the biological clock that tells you when to sleep and when to wake up, begins moving earlier. Your body starts winding down around 8 or 9 p.m., sometimes even earlier, and it wants to wake up with or before the sun, often around 5 or 5:30 in the morning. This isn't insomnia. This isn't a problem. This is your nervous system adjusting to a new, very natural schedule. At the same time, the structure of your sleep changes. You spend less time in the deep, heavy sleep you had in your younger years and more time in lighter stages. That means you may wake up 2, 3, 4 times a night. You might feel like you're never really deeply asleep, and in the morning, you might wonder if you actually rested at all. Here's the reassuring truth. Waking up frequently at night does not automatically mean you had bad sleep. Research shows that our expectations about sleep are often what cause the most distress, not the sleep patterns themselves. Your energy peaks shift often. Most women in their 80s feel sharpest and most energetic in the late morning, roughly between 8 a.m. and noon. After lunch, there's often a noticeable dip, and by mid-afternoon, the couch starts looking very appealing. I want to tell you about Dorothy. Dorothy is 83, a retired school librarian from Ohio who spent the first 2 years after her 80th birthday absolutely frustrated by her new sleep pattern. She'd go to bed at 9, wake up at midnight, lie awake for an hour, drift back to sleep, wake again at 4, and by morning she felt defeated before her day even started. Her doctor reassured her that nothing was wrong medically, so Dorothy tried something different. Instead of fighting the pattern, she leaned into it. She started keeping a small lamp and a book of crossword puzzles on her nightstand for those midnight wake-up windows. She rearranged her mornings to tackle her most important tasks, letter writing, reading, a gentle walk in the neighborhood, before noon. She gave herself permission to rest after lunch without any guilt. "I stopped feeling like a failure at sleeping," Dorothy told her daughter, and started treating it like a different schedule, not a broken one. 3 practical things you can do starting this week. First, track your energy for 7 days. Keep a little notepad near your chair and jot down when you feel good, when you feel low. You'll start to see your personal pattern, and that's your roadmap. Second, match your activities to your energy. Save mentally or physically demanding things, appointments, phone calls, grocery shopping, for your high-energy windows. Use your low-energy hours for gentle, restful things. Third, create a consistent wind-down routine in the evening. Dim the lights an hour before bed. Put the phone or tablet away. A cup of chamomile tea, a few pages of a novel, some light stretching. Give your body clear signals that it's time to slow down. The most important reframe here: your body isn't failing, it's adapting. And when you adapt with it, you might be surprised to find that these quieter mornings become some of your favorite hours of the day. Change number 2. Your social world shrinks, but also gets deeper. This one surprises a lot of women, and it can feel scary at first. But I want you to hear me out, because this change is not what it looks like on the surface. After 80, your social world naturally contracts. Some friendships fade, some people move to be near their own children or grandchildren, some friends pass away, and sometimes relationships that you poured energy into for decades simply drift. But here is what else happens, and this is the part nobody talks about. The relationships that remain become richer, more honest, and more nourishing than almost anything you experienced in your 40s, 50s, or 60s. The small talk falls away, the performing falls away. What's left is real. There's actually a psychological explanation for this. Researchers call it socio-emotional selectivity, a fancy way of saying that as we get older, we become more intentional about where we invest our emotional energy. We stop tolerating relationships that leave us feeling drained or unseen, and we move toward people who genuinely get us, who make us feel known. Many women in their 80s also discover something unexpected: new friendships, often formed in the most surprising places: a chair yoga class, a book club at the library, a senior center, a volunteer program at a hospital or school. And these new friendships, built on who you are right now rather than who you used to be, can feel more authentic than connections you've carried for decades. Think about Gloria, 81, from Atlanta. She'd had the same circle of friends since her 50s, a tight-knit group of women she'd met through her kids' school. When several of them moved away or became unable to get out much, Gloria felt her social life collapsing. She described it as one of the loneliest seasons of her life. Her daughter encouraged her to try a watercolor class at the local recreation center. Gloria resisted. "I'm not artsy," she said, but she went. Within 3 months, she had 2 new close friends, women who also happened to be in their late 70s and early 80s, women who were navigating the same thing she was. "We laugh about things we'd never say out loud anywhere else," Gloria says now. They get it. They're in it too. Here's how to work with this change instead of against it. Give yourself real permission to let some relationships go, without guilt, without lengthy explanations. Not every connection was meant to last forever, and releasing what no longer fits isn't abandonment, it's honesty. Actively look for places where you can meet people in your current life stage. Shared experience creates connection faster than shared history ever could. Invest more intentionally in your closest relationships. Longer conversations, more honesty. The things you've always wanted to say but held back. Say some of them now. And don't underestimate what technology can do. A video call with a daughter who lives across the country, a group chat with old friends from your working years, an online community of women going through exactly what you're going through. These are real connections, and they count. You aren't losing your social life at 80. You're distilling it down to what actually matters.
Change number 3. Time starts feeling completely different, and your priorities turn upside down. This is the change that catches most women completely off guard because it doesn't feel like a loss. It feels more like waking up. After 80, your relationship with time goes through a quiet but profound revolution. Days can feel shorter because your physical stamina has changed, but your sense of what actually matters, your clarity about how you want to spend the time you have, sharpens in a way that's almost startling. The things that used to feel urgent somehow stop feeling that way. The committee meetings you attended out of obligation, the family events you showed up to even when every bone in your body wanted to stay home, the phone calls you took from people who only ever made you feel worse about yourself, the standards you kept, the spotless house, the elaborate holiday meals, the carefully maintained appearance of having it all together. Suddenly, all of that starts to feel optional. And what fills the space? What you actually want, what you actually love, what makes you feel like yourself. Psychologists have a name for this: time perspective shift. When we sense that time is limited, not in a morbid way, just in a realistic way, we naturally stop spending it on things that don't feed us. We start choosing depth over breadth, meaning over obligation, joy over appearance. Let me tell you about Marjorie, an 82-year-old woman from Minnesota who spent decades volunteering for what felt like every organization in her community: PTA, church committees, neighborhood associations, hospital auxiliaries. She was the woman everyone called when they needed something organized, planned, or driven across town. After she turned 80, Marjorie started noticing something. She was tired in a way that rest didn't fix. Not physically tired, soul tired. She'd been saying yes to everyone else for 60 years and nearly forgotten what she actually wanted to say yes to. She spent one weekend writing down everything she'd always wanted to do but never had time for. The list surprised her. She wanted to learn to bake artisan bread. She wanted to sit on her back porch in the evenings and watch birds. She wanted to write down the stories from her childhood before they were gone. So she started, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. She stepped back from most of her commitments, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just gradually, graciously. And she filled that time with bread dough and bird feeders and a yellow spiral notebook where she wrote about growing up in a small town in the 1950s. I feel more useful now than I did when I was running myself ragged, because I'm finally doing what I was actually meant to do. Practical ways to embrace this change. Do a time audit of your typical week. Write down everything you do, and next to each thing, honestly note whether it energizes you or depletes you. The pattern will tell you everything. Practice saying, "Let me think about that," instead of automatically saying yes to requests. Give yourself the space to decide deliberately rather than reflexively. Make a list, your own version of Marjorie's list. What have you always wanted to do, learn, experience, make, create? Write it down and take it seriously. Have the conversations you've been putting off. Call the friend you've been meaning to call for 6 months. Say the things you want your children or grandchildren to know about who you are and who you were. At 80, you have the wisdom and the urgency to make these moments happen. Use both. Time isn't running out on you, it's running toward you, and you're finally free to decide where it goes.
Change number 4. Your memory changes, but your brain is actually becoming something more valuable. Okay, I know this is the one that worries you most. Let's talk about it honestly. Yes, after 80, your memory works differently than it did. There's no point pretending otherwise. You might forget where you set your glasses down 20 minutes ago. A name you've known for 30 years might suddenly slip out of reach right when you need it. You might walk into the garage to get something, and by the time you get there, the reason you came has completely evaporated. That is real. That happens, and it can be genuinely frustrating. But here is what is also real, and what almost nobody talks about. Your brain at 80 is not simply a slower version of your brain at 40. It has actually reorganized itself. It has traded certain capabilities for others. And the trade, when you look at it clearly, is more balanced than the fear-based narrative around memory loss would have you believe. Short-term memory, the kind that holds new names, new information, the errand you were running, does become less reliable. That's the loss side of the equation. But the gain side? Your brain becomes significantly better at something researchers call pattern recognition and knowledge integration. In plain English, you get better at seeing the big picture. You get better at spotting when something doesn't add up. You get better at knowing, quickly and instinctively, when advice someone is giving you is wrong, when a situation is more complicated than it looks, when a person isn't being entirely truthful. Young people call this wisdom and think of it as something soft and vague. Neuroscientists call it crystallized intelligence, and it's measurably, provably real. The neural pathways built over 80 years of experience allow you to make connections and recognize patterns that a faster, younger brain simply cannot match. Think of it this way. A brand new computer processes information quickly, but it doesn't know anything. It has no judgment. Your 80-year-old brain may not process as fast, but it knows an enormous amount, and it uses that knowledge in ways that pure processing speed cannot replicate. I want to tell you about Helen, 85, a retired family physician from North Carolina. Helen noticed in her early 80s that she could no longer effortlessly memorize long strings of data, a skill that had been central to her medical practice for decades. She found it genuinely unsettling. But she also noticed something else. When her grown children came to her with difficult decisions about their marriages, their careers, their children, she found herself seeing straight to the heart of the problem with a clarity that surprised even her. "I can see through the noise now," she described it. "I know which things matter and which things don't. I couldn't always do that when I was younger." Helen adapted by building what she calls her external memory system, a small calendar for appointments, a running list on her kitchen counter of things to remember day to day. She stopped apologizing for using these tools and started seeing them the same way she'd see reading glasses, a practical solution, nothing more. 4 things you can do to work with your changing memory. Build external systems and use them without embarrassment. Write things down. Use the calendar on your phone or a paper one on the counter. Set reminders. There is no award for trying to hold everything in your head. Stay socially and mentally engaged. Conversation, reading, crossword puzzles, card games, learning something new. These are not cures for memory changes, but they support brain health in real, documented ways. Get enough sleep and manage stress. Both sleep deprivation and chronic stress impair memory significantly, and both are manageable, which connects back to change number 1. Know the difference between normal changes and warning signs. Forgetting where you put your keys, normal. Forgetting what keys are for, worth a conversation with your doctor. Don't catastrophize ordinary forgetfulness, but also don't dismiss changes that genuinely concern you. Your memory is not what it was, but your judgment, your wisdom, your ability to read a room and a person and a situation, those things have never been stronger.
Change number 5. You finally start living like yourself. I promised you that the 5th change would surprise you. I hope it does, in the best possible way. Because this one isn't a loss at all. It's arguably the greatest gift that aging can give you. After 80, something remarkable happens to the way you move through the world. The opinions of people who don't love you stop mattering quite so much. The expectations you spent decades trying to meet start loosening their grip. The version of yourself you performed for an audience, the capable one, the agreeable one, the selfless one, the one who held it all together, she starts to step back, and the real you step forward. This isn't a small thing. For most American women, an enormous portion of their adult life was spent managing other people's perceptions. What will the neighbors think? What will my mother-in-law say? Am I being a good wife, a good mother, a good daughter, a good employee, a good community member? The checking, the adjusting, the careful management of how you were seen, it was exhausting, even when you didn't realize how exhausting it was.
At 80, much of that scaffolding simply falls away. Your children are adults, the career is over, the mortgage is paid, the major proving is done. And in the space that opens up, something astonishing can happen. You get to find out who you actually are. Women in their 80s report more than any other age group a sense of authenticity, of finally being able to say what they think, wear what they want, spend their time how they choose, and love who and what they love without apology. This freedom shows up in beautiful, sometimes hilarious ways. The woman who spent 60 years wearing neutral colors because her husband liked them, now wearing the brightest yellow coat anyone has ever seen. The woman who always kept a perfectly tidy home for guests who might stop by, who now has art supplies spread across the kitchen table at all times and doesn't care one bit. The woman who spent decades keeping her opinions to herself to avoid conflict, who now says exactly what she thinks with a smile that dares you to argue. Let me tell you about Virginia. Virginia is 84, a widow in Phoenix, Arizona. For most of her adult life, she was the quiet one, careful, proper, conflict avoidant. She raised 4 children almost entirely on her own after her husband became ill, and she held herself to a standard of selflessness that left very little room for her own desires. After she turned 81, something started changing, slowly at first. She started making small choices purely for herself. She got a dog, something she'd always wanted, even though her kids worried it would be too much work. She started going to line dancing classes at the senior center, even though she'd never been much of a dancer. She booked a solo trip to see her sister in Florida on the train, something she'd always wanted to do. "People keep asking me if I'm okay," she laughed. "I'm better than okay. I'm finally doing what I feel like doing. I spent so many years thinking about everybody else. Now I get to think about me a little." Her children were initially worried about the changes, but they quickly realized that their mother was happier, genuinely, visibly happier than they'd seen her in years. Her grandchildren especially loved this version of their grandmother, the one who was spontaneous and funny and a little unpredictable. This is what authentic freedom looks like in your 80s. Not recklessness, not selfishness, just honesty, the permission to finally be yourself, fully, comfortably, without apology. Here's how to step into this freedom. Ask yourself, what have I always wanted to do that I talked myself out of? Write down 3 things. Now, ask yourself what's actually stopping you. Often the answer is nothing real. Identify one thing you do primarily for the approval of others and see what it would feel like to let it go. Not dramatically, just quietly to yourself. I don't have to do this anymore. Experiment with expressing yourself more directly. Say what you think at dinner. Wear the outfit that makes you feel good. Hang the painting you love, even if it doesn't match the room. Small acts of authenticity build on themselves. Surround yourself with people who respond to the real you, and gently step back from those who only liked the performed version. You spent 8 decades becoming who you are. It would be a shame to keep that person hidden now. Let's step back for a moment and look at all 5 changes together, because when you see them as a whole, something important becomes clear. Your energy patterns shift, and in the process, you learn to protect what's precious and stop wasting it on what isn't. Your social world contracts, and in the process, your remaining relationships become more honest, more nourishing, and more real than they've ever been. Your relationship with time transforms, and in the process, you become capable of choosing your life instead of just living it by default. Your memory changes, and in the process, your judgment, wisdom, and ability to see clearly only gets stronger. And underneath all of it, slowly and quietly, you start to become more fully yourself than you've ever been allowed to be. None of these changes are small. Some of them are genuinely hard. There are real losses in the 80s, and I don't want to pretend there aren't. But there are also real gains that are only possible because of the life you've lived and the person you've become. The women who thrive in their 80s aren't the ones who manage to avoid these changes. They're the ones who understand them, who stop fighting against them, and who find a way to use them. That can be you. It probably already is, in more ways than you realize. Before you go, I want to know which of these 5 changes resonated with you the most. Are you in the middle of one of them right now? Has one of them surprised you? Is there something I said that you want to push back on? Leave me a comment below. This channel is a community, and the most valuable thing in the comments isn't my words, it's yours. When you share your experience, you let another woman know that she isn't alone in what she's going through. If this video felt useful, please share it with a friend, a sister, a daughter, or anyone who might need to hear that 80 doesn't have to look the way we've been taught to fear it. And if you're new here, welcome. We talk about real life for older women, the honest parts, the hard parts, and the surprisingly good parts that nobody warns you about. Take good care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.